March 5th, 1772. A noisy crowd filled Boston Commons to remember a fateful incident 2 years earlier called the Boston Massacre. Massachusetts leader Josiah Quincy recalled that night when 5 Americans were killed by British soldiers.
Words cannot express the pain we felt when our streets were stained with the blood of our brothers, when our ears heard the groans of the dying, and our eyes saw the twisted bodies of the dead.
Conflict between the American colonies and Great Britain centered on the issue of taxation without representation. Since 1764, the 13 American colonies had resisted taxes such as the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and most recently, the Townshend Act. In each case, the British Parliament had taxed goods brought into the American colonies without the consent of the colonists. Americans had no vote or voice in Parliament. The anniversary of the Boston Massacre also reminded American colonists about the Quartering Act. This law required the colonists to support British soldiers stationed in their colonies. Tension between some colonists and redcoats had started the Boston Massacre.
Here is your receipt.
To calm colonial anger, Parliament repealed all its new taxes, except for the tax on tea. Most colonists were loyal to the king. But by the time Parliament ended the Townshend Acts, many Americans no longer trusted the British government. In Boston, Samuel Adams began organizing groups known as Committees of Correspondence to coordinate responses to British actions. They helped to build links across the long distances between colonies and to focus their grievances against Britain. What was the Boston Massacre? Explain the meaning of taxation without representation. Why did Parliament adopt the Quartering Act?
I didn't realize how important the Boston Tea Party really was. I thought it was just a bunch of guys throwing some tea into the harbor.
Yeah, the colonists were really angry about being taxed so much by Britain.
Also by the monopoly created for the East India Tea Company.
I guess they just wanted to have control of their own trade.
Yeah, I think it was a real act of defiance.
In the spring of 1773, a new tax on tea again stirred up trouble between the colonists and Parliament. The British government wanted to create a monopoly for an English business called the East India Company.
No right to put a tax upon us unless we are represented in Parliament.
Once again, the British misjudged the colonists. Most Americans resented Parliament controlling their trade. Others denounced taxation without representation. 4 cities were targeted to receive the first shipments of East India tea: New York, Boston, Charleston, and Philadelphia. American patriot leaders decided to resist delivery. The only question was, where would conflict come? Not New York. The ships carrying the tea were late arriving. Not Philadelphia. The captain of the tea ship was persuaded to sail back to England. In Charleston, South Carolina, the tea was unloaded, stored, and later destroyed. The real showdown took place in Boston. On December 16, 1773, an angry crowd of over 5,000 people filled the Old South Church. 3 tea ships sat in Boston Harbor, but all efforts to send them back to England had failed. Suddenly, someone in the crowd yelled,
Boston Harbor at Teapot tonight!
Soon, about 60 men quietly slipped out of the church. Dressed as Indians, they reappeared at the dock where the 3 tea ships were anchored. They boarded the ships and dumped 342 chests filled with tea into the Boston Harbor. Patriots called this the Boston Tea Party. The British Prime Minister, Lord North, called it treason. In the spring of 1774, town meetings were banned in Boston. the port was closed until all the tea was paid for, and 4,000 British soldiers arrived to put the city under military rule. Parliament stripped Massachusetts of the right to elect their own colonial government, and British officials and soldiers accused of a crime could be sent back to England for trial. Parliament then passed a new Quartering Act, giving British officers more power to house their troops in American homes. Colonists everywhere in America were furious over these new laws. They called them the Intolerable Acts. If Parliament could deny political liberty in Massachusetts, liberties everywhere were threatened. Committees of correspondence sprang into action. Letters flew from one colony to another, urging a new boycott on all British goods. Patriot leaders met in Philadelphia in September 1774. This gathering was called the First Continental Congress. They voted to disobey the Intolerable Acts and not to buy or sell British products. Committees searched out merchants still trading British goods, printed their names in local newspapers, and forced them to stop or leave town. Soon, these committees became the unofficial government in their cities and towns. They organized volunteer soldiers, called militias, and gathered weapons. Though all this was against the law, these patriot committees had strong community support. As the militia grew, some patriots sought the support of the Indians. In the South, the leaders of the Creek Nation gave them this advice.
We thought all the English people were as one, but now we hear that they have a difference among themselves. We hope that they drop their quarrels and not fight with one another.
Some people known as loyalists agreed. They had close ties with Britain and opposed breaking with the mother country. Many were government officials, soldiers in the British Army, religious leaders in the Anglican Church, or merchants who depended on trade with England. Back in England, most members of Parliament were very angry at the Patriot actions. A few British leaders, led by Edmund Burke, did speak up for compromise. Burke warned that force might slow the American colonists, but ultimately it would fail because
the spirit of liberty is stronger in the English colonies than in any other people of the earth.
But most British leaders were in no mood for compromise. Instead, they went on the offensive. In April 1775, Parliament told Thomas Gage, the commanding general in Boston, to move against the rude rabble who were gathering weapons and preparing for war.
You had better act now, while a small group of your soldiers can still stop this ragged bunch of poorly armed troublemakers. If you wait, you will most certainly face a larger and stronger force later.
General Gage agreed. His spies told him that in nearby Concord village, colonists were hiding guns and supplies. The time had come to act. Gage decided to send 700 British troops to seize those supplies. On the way, they were to stop in Lexington and arrest two Patriot leaders, Sam Adams and John Hancock. But the Patriots had their own spies and sent two messengers, Paul Revere and William Dawes, to warn the Minutemen in Lexington and Concord. The Minutemen were the members of the local militia who chose that name because they could be ready to fight with a minute's warning. Paul Revere described his nighttime ride.
I set off upon a very good horse. It was about 11 o'clock. I saw two men on horseback under a tree. When I got near them, I discovered they were British officers. One tried to get ahead of me, and the other to take me. I turned my horse very quick and galloped away. In Medford, I wakened the captain of the Minutemen, and after that I alarmed almost every house till I got to Lexington.
Paul Revere did his job well. Samuel Adams and John Hancock had time to escape, and when the Redcoats reached Lexington, they faced 70 armed Minutemen. The British commander ordered them to go home. The American captain, John Parker, saw that he was outgunned, so he called on his men to withdraw. But suddenly a shot was fired. The British soldiers returned fire. 8 Americans lay dead. Quickly, the British moved on to Concord, 5 miles away, but the news from Lexington spread even faster. Other Minutemen grabbed their muskets and headed for Concord. After a brief clash at North Bridge, near Concord, the British decided to return to Boston. On their march back, thousands of militiamen fired on them from behind trees, bushes, and houses along the road. By the end of the day, 70 redcoats had been killed and over 200 wounded. One British officer there would never forget the scene.
The hills on each side of us were covered with rebels. A very hot fire came down on us without stopping. We at first kept marching in order. In return, their fire as hot as we received it. But when we came within a mile of Lexington, we began to run out of ammunition. Our soldiers became frightened and started to run instead of marching in order.
Get your pielock, Jeremiah. What's the matter?
Over the next few days, thousands of volunteers from all over New England poured into Boston. None had uniforms, and not everyone had a gun or sword. But they were ready to fight.
Thousands of redcoats, families dead and fleeing.
Why was the First Continental Congress held? What caused the battles of Lexington and Concord? Did General Gage's show of force succeed?
Hi, Stacy. Oh, hi, Anne. Gosh, history. I didn't understand a word he was talking about today. Do you understand what the First Continental Congress did?
Yeah, the First Continental Congress voted to disobey the Intolerable Acts passed by the British.
So what did these people do about the acts?
Well, they formed committees to find people still trading with the British and make them stop. They built up the local militias and stockpiled weapons and gunpowder.
Oh, so that's why the British wanted to march on Lexington and Concord to get the weapons.
Yeah.
Okay, so what the Boston?
You've seen the redcoats. Do you need to...
Outright war now seemed inevitable. News from Lexington and Concord quickly spread to the other colonies. More colonists joined the ranks of the Patriots. In May 1775, excited colonial leaders met again in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. John Adams complained,
So many questions, political, commercial, and military, press and crowd upon us so fast that we know not what to do first.
Abigail Adams, John's wife, wrote to her husband in Philadelphia.
I desire you remember the ladies and be more generous to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the husbands. If attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to rebel. We will not be bound by laws in which we have no representation.
Congress soon created a new American army and named the 43-year-old Virginia planter, George Washington, as commander-in-chief. Washington had won the respect of many Americans for his part in the French and Indian War. Now his tough job was to turn young farm boys into skilled soldiers. In fact, fighting had already flared again in Boston. The British tried to take control of nearby Charlestown. The Patriots dug in on a high point called Breed's Hill. British General William Howe ordered his men to take the hill from the Americans. Crowds of Bostonians climbed up on rooftops, in church steeples, and even on the masts of ships in the harbor to get a good view of the fighting. As drums and fifes played, the British soldiers marched up the hill in straight lines. Although the American soldiers had little training and few supplies, they did have one advantage. They were hidden in their trenches and could fire down on the British. Twice, the rapid and deadly fire of American muskets stopped the British from advancing. But as the British tried a third time to capture the hill, the Americans ran short of ammunition, forcing them to retreat. When he heard the order, one young volunteer said,
I jumped over the walls and ran for about half a mile. Well, all about me, the balls, they flew like hailstones, and cannons roared like thunder.
This battle was called Bunker Hill, named for a hill close to where the fighting actually took place. Although it was a British victory, they did not celebrate. The Americans showed that they could stand up to the mighty British Army. Rhode Island patriot General Nathaniel Greene was pleased with the American performance.
I think we have little reason to complain. I wish we could sell them another hill at the same price.
Thanks to Bunker Hill, many more Americans began to think that independence might really be won. But not all the Patriot soldiers were equally excited by the American victories. African-American Prince Whipple told his master,
"You are going to fight for your liberty, but I have none to fight for."
I can't imagine what it would have been like to be a delegate in Continental Congress.
Well, I guess it would have been pretty tough.
How so?
Well, the British needed money and they wanted to get it from the Americans.
But the Americans had no representatives in Parliament. So that's what they mean by no taxation without representation.
Yeah.
Despite the bloodshed, most Americans still hoped that a permanent break could be avoided. But as they wished for peace, the Patriots also prepared for war. The Second Continental Congress continued its work, building an army, finding new trading partners in Europe, and printing money to buy military supplies. Then, in January 1776, an English customs agent who had lived in America for only 2 years wrote a powerful pamphlet that changed the minds of many Americans about independence. The man was Thomas Paine, and his pamphlet was called Common Sense. Within 3 months, 120,000 copies had been sold, a huge number for those days. Thomas Paine said that Britain had taken advantage of the colonies and that America would actually be stronger once it was independent.
I have heard it said by some that since America prospered because of her ties to Great Britain in the past, the same is necessary for her future happiness. Nothing can be more wrong. I say that America would have done just as well if no European power had noticed it. There will always be a market for American goods as long as eating is the custom in Europe.
Thomas Paine's common sense seemed like perfectly good sense to many Americans. By the spring of 1776, British authority in the colonies was collapsing. Royal governors sailed for home. The Second Continental Congress asked the colonies to write new constitutions to govern themselves. On June 7th in Philadelphia, a Virginia delegate to the Second Congress, Richard Henry Lee, made a daring proposal.
These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states.
With these words, the final countdown to independence began. A committee was appointed to write a Declaration of Independence. The committee included some well-known patriots, John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. The committee gave the job of writing the Declaration to Thomas Jefferson. The 34-year-old Virginia lawyer was one of the youngest members of the Congress, but he was known for his fine and forceful writing style. In a letter to a friend, John Adams explained why Jefferson was chosen.
You may wonder why so young a man as Mr. Jefferson was picked to head the committee for writing a Declaration of Independence. Mr. Jefferson came into Congress with a reputation for literature, science, and a happy talent for writing. Though he did not talk much in Congress, he was so prompt, frank, and decisive in committees and conversation that he soon seized upon my heart, and I gave him my vote.
Adams' opinion of Jefferson proved to be correct. On July 2nd, Congress voted for independence and reviewed Jefferson's work. The Declaration has 3 main parts. The first part, or preface, declares that all human beings possess unalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
The middle section tells why the colonists are angry at King George III. It accuses the king of trying to destroy representative government, of taxing the people without their agreement, and of cutting off colonial trade. Finally, the document declares the former colonies independent from Mother England. Late in the afternoon of July 4th, 1776, Congress approved the Declaration. Americans found many ways of celebrating their nation's birth. Pulling down statues of George III was popular. About 1 month later, 56 members of Congress assembled to sign the Declaration. After placing his name on the Declaration, Franklin warned,
"Now we must all hang together, or we shall all hang separately."
The long road to independence began in 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War and ended in Philadelphia with Jefferson's Declaration of Human Rights. Along the way, Americans found themselves growing apart from the mother country because of the vast distance across the Atlantic Ocean and between colonies, differences in religion, countries of origin, languages, and ways of making a living. They also grew apart as they established their own representative legislatures. After the French and Indian War, the colonists resented the proclamation of 1763 and the Currency Act, Britain's trade policies, including the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Townshend Act, and Tea Act. The colonies resisted these taxes through boycotts and other forms of protests because they considered them forms of taxation without representation. The colonists also resented the British decision to station troops in their cities and towns, called the Quartering Acts. Resentment against this act flared in the Boston Massacre. The Boston Tea Party was Boston's response to the tea tax and led to the Intolerable Acts, the first battles of the war, and the decision to sign a Declaration of Independence. It would take a long and bloody war to make Jefferson's words a reality. The American Revolution signaled the birth of the first new nation in modern history and a symbol of hope for our country and for people seeking freedom ever since.